Now it's time for Perspective on the programme, and the oppression of Afghan women continues unabated before the eyes of the world. Earlier this month, the Taliban imposed severe new restrictions, with women not only obliged to cover their faces, but now forbidden even from raising their voices, singing or reading aloud in public. Western countries, led by the US and EU, have condemned the new laws, but also seem, well, pretty resigned to the Taliban regime. The one positive from their point of view, that it does at least provide some stability in the region. Well, we're going to talk now to Heather Barr. She's Interim Women's Rights Deputy Director for Human Rights Watch. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme today. First of all, just bring us up to date on what actually these new laws, they were brought in on August the 21st, what do they actually mean for women in Afghanistan?
So you've mentioned several of the provisions already. Another one that's worth mentioning is that women are now banned from traveling in any kind of transport without a male chaperone with them. Previously, there was a restriction in place that said they couldn't travel more than 72 kilometers, but now it seems to be any distance at all. And one of the other things that's worth mentioning about this new law is that it codified into law some restrictions that were already in place in a more informal way through decrees. And so overall, it just represents this continued sort of slide toward more and more dehumanization of women and more of a situation where they're essentially prisoners in their homes with no ability to participate in public life. And what's so frustrating is that, as you've said, the world seems to be kind of responding with a shrug.
Just keeping on the theme of what it actually means, I mean, how respected are the laws there? Do people have to follow them very, very strictly or risk imprisonment or being detained in some way?
So these laws and decrees are enforced with absolute brutality. The Taliban beat people, they arrest people, they torture people. Women's rights protesters who've tried to push back against these laws have been jailed along with their family members, disappeared, tortured, and many have had to flee into exile. So there isn't really the option to not respect the rules issued by the Taliban. And these rules are often very arbitrary as well. They're not explained very clearly. They're enforced however an individual member of the Taliban at a particular checkpoint feels like enforcing them. So it's a very terrifying situation for men and boys too, but particularly for women and girls.
And in individual homes in Afghanistan, presumably a lot of women and indeed men as well, as you say, would really rather these laws were not in place at all and that women were able to go about their own lives as they wanted to.
Yeah, I think that these laws are really out of step with how Afghans want to live their lives, not just women and girls, but men and boys as well. One of the things the Taliban have done is they've started punishing men for the actions of women. So if a woman, for example, is accused of not being sufficiently covered up in public, and I think you've mentioned that the new law now requires them to cover not just their entire body, but their faces as well. The punishment is sometimes doled out to the male relative of that woman who could face imprisonment. So men are kind of being forced to become the jailers of their female relatives. And, I think this really ignores the way that there is a great demand in Afghanistan for girls' education, for women to be able to participate in the workforce. But the Taliban have been so brutal about enforcing their rules that it doesn't seem to matter what the population wants.
Why do you think the Taliban is going further and further? I mean, when the Taliban first came back into power, there were a lot of hopes, weren't there, that it would be a much more lenient regime, but little by little by little, that obviously has not been the case.
I don't think that Afghan women and girls ever shared those hopes, to be honest, because they know who the Taliban are and they knew how life was in the parts of the country that the Taliban were controlling before August 15th. But I think the international diplomatic community sort of engaged in quite a bit of magical thinking about a new Taliban 2.0. In terms of why they're continuing to crack down more and more, I think it's because they've seen that they can. They've seen that there won't be a meaningful international response, or at least there hasn't been one so far. I think one thing that happened in recent months that was particularly harmful is that at the very end of June, beginning of July, the United Nations convened a meeting that was called the Doha 3 meeting. It's part of a process called the Doha process. They wanted the Taliban to attend the meeting, and to convince the Taliban to come, they made enormous concessions, including saying that no Afghan women would be invited to the main meeting and taking human rights off the agenda. And I think it's not a coincidence that in the wake of that meeting, we've seen this new law from the Taliban. We've also seen them banning the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Afghanistan from entering the country. I think it's because they're feeling that they've got the international community wrapped around their finger.
So let's talk about that response then. I mean, why do you think it has been so poor?
Does the world really care about women's rights? I think we have to ask that question. I mean, it's good to see countries like France adopting a feminist foreign policy, but there has to be content behind that. It has to mean something. And we need countries around the world that say that they care about women's rights to really be doing much more to stand with women in Afghanistan. And it's important to say that there are things that they can do that would be helpful, that would be meaningful. And those are all strategies around holding the Taliban accountable for the ways in which they're committing crimes and violating international law.
So how do they do that then?
Well, we've got 4 options for you. The first is supporting the International Criminal Court, bringing criminal charges against Taliban leaders for the crime of gender persecution. The second is that one or more states could bring a case at the International Court of Justice, challenging the Taliban's violations of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The third is there's a campaign going on right now by Afghan women calling for the crime of gender apartheid to be codified under international law. So that's something that states could seriously consider. And finally, my organization and others this month at the Human Rights Council will be calling for the UN to create a new mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of crimes being committed in Afghanistan.
Do you think any of that would make any difference? I mean, we've been talking about earlier on in the programme, we were talking about Vladimir Putin being in Mongolia and the International Criminal Court having an arrest warrant out on him, but actually that's not going to be carried out. I mean, would any of those things really make the Taliban think again?
Well, in your previous story, you also talked about how Vladimir Putin is traveling less these days since there's a warrant for his arrest. So nothing is a magic wand that you can wave and fix things. But I think that any of these approaches, or some combination of several of them, would halt the kind of acceptance that we're seeing of Taliban abuses and make it more clear that this kind of oppression of women is not acceptable to the international community. I feel like one of the things that's been missing in this discussion is an understanding of how what's happening in Afghanistan has major implications for women's rights globally, and we should be responding accordingly.
Why do you say that? I mean, there are other countries that you're thinking may continue to go down a similar path?
Well, I think we've seen, misogynist groups in other countries feeling emboldened by the Taliban's, by what they perceive as the Taliban's success. And I think it matters a lot that the bar for how bad things can be for women and girls in a country just became radically lower on August 15th, 2021. And I think that matters to women everywhere and should matter to countries that say that they care deeply about women's rights, as France has said by adopting a feminist foreign policy several years ago.
Great to talk to you on the programme today. Thanks very much for being with us. Heather Barr from Human Rights Watch. Thanks for joining us on today's Perspective. Thanks.